Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which features Ryan Busse, who is the author of Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. Before we begin today, I want to remind you that we have another event this week on Thursday, which will be the first in-person event we have at the Foley Institute since the pandemic began. And that's at noon. We have Tom Preston, who's the C.O. Johnson Distinguished Professor of Political Science at WSU, and he'll be discussing the unfolding events in Ukraine. Let me also remind you to mark your calendars on March 24th at 4 p.m. when we have James Mattis, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, who will be speaking in Bryan Hall Auditorium, and he'll be discussing threats to democracy at home and abroad. So plan to join us then. As always, you can learn more about all of our upcoming events and other Foley Institute activities by subscribing to our YouTube station, liking us on Facebook, or emailing us at tsfoley@wsu.edu. So let me introduce today's event. It is estimated that there are more than 393 million guns in the United States today, more guns than people. In fact, about 1.2 guns for every American. Just to the north, in a country that shares our border and our culture, there are far fewer guns, less than 0.4 guns for each Canadian, 1/4 the number per capita as in the United States. In England, even fewer, less than 0.1 guns per person, or 1/100th of the number of guns per capita as in the United States. Indeed, no other country even comes close to the saturation of guns in society as we have here in the United States. Last year alone, Americans bought 19 million new guns. During that same time, 21,000 Americans died from gun violence, not counting suicides. And there were 693 mass shootings, defined as 4 or more individuals who were shot. This represented a 13% increase in the number of mass shootings from the previous year, which was also a record. Mass shootings claimed the lives of 702 people last year, including 22 who died in school shootings, and 3,000 more who were injured. Despite these chilling statistics, it is nearly impossible to discuss gun control policies today. The gun industry and its lobby arm, the NRA, used to support responsible gun ownership and gun safety measures, but today resist any regulation or constraint. Common sense policies like universal background checks or restricting the sale of military-style weapons are supported by the vast majority of Americans and were once supported by broad bipartisan coalitions of elected policymakers. But today, such measures are non-starters in Congress and provoke sharply polarized reactions from elected officials. The debate over gun policy in the US has become intractable. Even in the wake of horrific events like massacres at Sandy Hook Elementary and Stoneman Douglas High Schools, political leaders are left offering little more than hopes and prayers for grieving families. What has gone wrong? What has happened to America's gun culture and gun politics? And is there any way forward in this debate? We're fortunate to have with us today someone with direct knowledge about these issues and firsthand experience in the gun industry. Ryan Busse is the former firearms executive who helped build one of the world's most iconic gun companies and was nominated multiple times for the prestigious Shooting Industry Person of the Year award. Ryan spent his life working proudly in the gun industry, but now says the cultural touchstones of his youth were gradually twisted into troubling NRA extremism, which became a force radicalizing our national politics. Ryan spent 2 years trying to fight against extremism from inside the industry, but eventually felt compelled to leave the career he loved in 2020. His memoir, Gunfight, is a call to hunters, sportsmen, and gun enthusiasts to reclaim control of the NRA and the industry and restore balance to America's gun policies. His book has received national praise as a deeply personal account and a critically important conversation bridging the divide over gun politics in the US. Busse is also a conservationist and an environmental advocate, and he remains a proud outdoorsman, gun owner, father, and resident of Montana. Ryan said he's going to speak for about 30 minutes today, after which we will have some time for discussion and some Q&A. If you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's TS as in Tom S. Foley at wsu.edu. So Ryan, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back later with some questions from our audience.
Well, thank you, Cornell, and thank you, everybody at Washington State. I appreciate the willingness and venue to tackle something as critically important as this topic. I'm glad to be here to speak about it. Obviously, I wish much of what we're going to talk about today was not such a necessary topic in our country, but it is. I'm only going to correct Cornell in one place. I fought against the industry. He mentioned I fought against the industry for 2 years. I fought against the industry for almost 20. I was in the firearms industry for 25 years in 4 days, but who's counting? Much of that time was spent with me coming to the realization that the industry that I was in my childhood dream had been twisted into something that was at the very center of what was modifying our country, and in my opinion, not for the better. And I think what I'd like to impart, sort of the through line, one of the through lines of my book, is that gun politics is not, gun issues, gun politics and firearms are not just in and of themselves. They are central to the thing that has divided our country. So if you, like many of us, have lived through a time when you can't speak to your family members over politics, or your workplaces are divided, or you watch the news and notice that nothing can get done in Washington, D.C. because we now live in an all or nothing world, literally all against us or all for us. These are the politics and the situation that was developed by the industry that I worked in for so long. So with that in mind, I'm going to attempt to share a PowerPoint screen here, and we'll see if we can get on to the presentation. So first off, we're speaking about the thing that has radicalized our country. And really the reason that I believe this is important, because we need to understand the truth of how our nation got here if we're going to make any progress in undoing this radicalization. And as Cornell mentioned, my book is deeply personal, and I think for purposes of this discussion, who I am and what I've done and where I grew up is important. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about me and where I sit before we get to the rest of this here. I'm still a firearms owner. I'm a hunter. These are pictures of me and my family. I literally don't know how many guns I own. My boys hunt and shoot with me every chance we get. And I like to joke. I don't know that it's actually a joke. It may be truth. Many people ran out of toilet paper during the pandemic. We almost ran out of ammunition. And then really that's not far from the truth. I grew up on a ranch with guns as part of my life, and my father's upbringing. They were very important. Apparently, I also grew up with a very large felt cowboy hat and a very serious look too. That wasn't by design, but these are pictures of me growing up on the ranch, and guns were central to so many of the best parts of my life. And I think that's the way it is for many people across the country. So as some people struggle to understand how it is that our culture, that gun culture can be used and twisted, it's because it's very integral to people's upbringing. I went on to work in the firearms industry for a bit over 25 years. I helped build one of the largest and most influential firearms companies in the country. The name of that company is Kimber. Was very proud of what we did. I fought at every turn to keep Kimber and my career above some of the very troubling trends that I saw, very irresponsible marketing, this sort of wedding to AR-15s and aggressive weapons of war, which have become obviously very overt political symbols in our country today. I doubt that you can drive down the street. I'm in Kalispell, Montana. I doubt you can drive down the street in many Eastern Washington towns, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, much of our country, and not see AR-15s as a political symbol on shirts, hats, T-shirts, bumper stickers. There's a reason for that. I eventually, when I left the industry in 2020, I wrote a book I started writing a book. My book came out last year, October 19th. And it's the first ever book written by a firearms industry insider about the truths and the experience of what went on during the last 25 years in our industry and in our country. It has been met with much critical acclaim, some measure of controversy, some fun things, some important things. Here's some of the things that I've been up to in the last couple months. Sitting at a table with Trevor Noah was serious but fun. Probably the first time a guy from Montana worked at a gun company is on the front page of the New York Times with his shotgun and his bird dogs. I was on Fresh Air with NPR. I've been on 30 or 40 or 50 other podcasts. I don't know. And I don't know how many newspaper articles. So it's been an important book in the country. The time frame that we're going to discuss today and that I discuss in my book essentially encompasses my time in the industry, and it also sadly overlaps the rise in political radicalization that we have all lived through 1995 to current. And so I think the most important thing to do, let's go back to 1995 for a second and think of what kind of country we had. I like to say that we had a country where we respected each other, we liked each other, we looked towards the future together. Here we have a former and a future president looking skyward. And I think this picture illustrates the sort of country, not that we didn't have partisan divides or disagreements, but it was a much different country in 1995 than it is today. In 1995, there were about 350,000 guns sold per month, or about 3 to 5 million units per year. So there were certainly a lot of guns sold, but we were a country that, again, looked towards the future together, and we had some measure of civility. Today, as Cornell mentioned, we now have new gun sales in the realm of 20 to 25 million units, new units per year. And you can put that on a graph. That's a rough estimate, is about a 614% increase in new gun sales from 1995 per year, from 1995 to current. And if you think back to that picture of former presidents Bush, Barbara Bush, Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton in 1995 to what we have today, this is a picture that I think is very emblematic of the reality, of the political reality that we face today. This was a picture that was taken at a Black Lives Matter rally in Kalispell, but I think it captures aptly the sort of political division that our country is undergoing and is living with today. And in fact, guns are at the very center of it. Today, we have a country that hates each other so much that we make a hero out of a 19-year-old boy in Kenosha, Wisconsin, because he used an AR-15 to kill fellow citizens. Kyle Rittenhouse is pictured here in the bottom right with proudly wearing his Black Rifle Coffee t-shirt and being celebrated as a hero after he killed those people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so I like to make the comparison that we have a 614% increase in firearm sales, but we have an infinite increase in fear and hatred. And I don't think that those two graphs, those two rapid increases, are a coincidence. Today, these are pictures from January 6th. The picture on the left is commonly referred to as zip tie guy. This gentleman racing through the Senate chambers with zip ties in his hand with the aim of apprehending senators, perhaps to take to the gallows in front of the January 6th insurrection. His hat that he's wearing that day, again, was a Black Rifle Coffee hat. So for him, obviously, firearms, specifically AR-15s, are at the very center of his political radicalization. The bottom right picture is a picture from January 6th as well. I've often noted that on January 6th, there were two types of flags. There were Trump and political flags, obviously, and then there were AR-15 flags. There weren't barbecue grill flags. There weren't Nike shoe flags. There weren't Ford truck flags. There were AR-15 flags. And so I think it's important for us to grasp that AR-15s, firearms, radicalization in and around guns, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, all those things, guns and gun radicalization is at the very center of our political division today. And we see that bearing out in everyday events like January 6th, like the Michigan Capitol, Kentucky Capitol, Virginia Capitol, and obviously pictures here. I did work in the firearms industry for 25 years. I was taught by my father, like so many people across our country, like so many kids in Washington, to be responsible with firearms. There's a deep sense of responsibility that comes along with that freedom. I taught my own boys that, and here is one of my boys' badge. He and I are attending a Black Lives Matter rally in Kalispell, Montana on June 6th of 2020. Just so happens that June 6th of 2020 is just about a month after the highest ever firearms sales day ever recorded in the United States. And that's because the tumult of that time, the hatred, fear, conspiracy, COVID, lockdowns, George Floyd, everything was coming together. And that's, again, not by accident. Here is a picture of the rally we attended that day. And these are the men that met us at that rally, like so many places across the country. These are men, open carry, armed intimidation, ready to shout us down and to really upend the sort of civil system that our country is based on, civil democracy. I like to say, if you doubt that guns are at the very center of our radicalization, just consider that you're at a dinner with 9 of your friends and waiting on the 10th, and then the 10th shows up and he's got a gun. I can promise you that your dinner and any sort of civil discussion is ended. And that's exactly what these armed men across the country have been doing. And there's a reason why guns, again, are at the very center of it. For me, this was very much like walking into a grocery store after I had been in, say, the cereal or macaroni and cheese industry for some years, and walking in and seeing your product on the shelf. I recognized these men. There were men and women, they're mostly men, as customers that my industry had developed, had fostered, had fueled with very aggressive and purposeful social media campaigns and advertising spending. In other words, these men were shocking, but they were not surprising to me. My son was attacked that day by one of these armed men. I was not foolish enough to be armed at that protest. My son was 12 years old and barely 75 pounds soaking wet. He was attacked that day, and I could tell during that attack, I did step in between them, and because I'm trying to maintain civility here, I won't repeat everything that I said to the man in order to get him to back away from my son after he poked him in the chest many times. But I could tell that this sort of responsibility that a democracy depends upon had been completely dispensed with. I could see that there in front of me, and that was a very distressful thing after having worked in the firearms industry for that long. I realized that it was very emblematic of what is going on across our country, and that how central guns are to the sort of radicalization, especially on the right, that we've seen. I recognized that really this whole radicalization is dependent on several tenets. And I had lived these tenets, and I had seen them being used in the firearms industry for, almost 2 decades. And I recognized them at that rally in our country today. Here they are. I've just enumerated them quickly on this PowerPoint screen, but we need a pressurized atmosphere. That guns are indeed central to intimidation and power because they break down the system of civility that we all depend upon. We've had a breakdown of social norms. It's not just laws. If you take open carry, for instance, obviously that screen where men are carrying AR-15s on streets, which happens so often these days, that's not something that has just become legal. That is legal. That practice has been legal across our country in many states for decades, if not a century. It's the social norm that has been changed. And those social norms are changed because of conspiracy theories. Again, I saw that inside the industry. Those conspiracy theories, they ratchet up the fear. Of course, hatred of the other or racism is used to increase the pressure of this whole system. And then you have this idea of freedom at all cost. In other words, no more responsibility. And so these are all tenets of the political radicalization that we've seen across our country, and they were all developed inside the firearms industry. Here's a picture snapped from an NRA convention. I like to speak about the breakdown in our social norms. There was a time when this sort of celebration of a weapon of war, especially with a young boy here of probably, I'm guessing, 10 years old, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, like this was not a social norm you would cross. Here's another social norm that the firearms industry has seen fit to cross. And this has been in the news in the last few days. This is the advertisement that launched the Bushmaster XM15. It was considered to be a very edgy, aggressive campaign. It launched in late 2010, really came to the news in 2012. the XM15 and the Consider Your Man card reissued campaign, this was the gun that was used by Adam Lanza in Sandy Hook. And so you can see how even going back 10 years ago, 12 years ago, how these sorts of aggressive breaking downs of norms resulted in some very disastrous things in our country. Again, this is in the news because Remington, which purchased Bushmaster, their insurance company just settled for $73 million with the Sandy Hook families over this exact advertising campaign. Here's an example of how racism and hatred of the other was used in the firearms industry before it was quote unquote cool at MAGA rallies and far right rallies across the country. This is a picture I snapped in that same NRA show, 2012, of a man that was walking around selling these t-shirts to anyone he could at the NRA convention. And he was getting a lot of laughs and high fives. I asked him if I could snap this picture. There's a notation of this and many other t-shirts and hats like this that I often witnessed. So it's not as though there were white hoods marching up and down the aisles, but there was this very overt and sort of wink, wink acceptance of racism. I believe Glenn Beck, who was then very much on his birther kick about President Obama, spoke to a large sellout audience at this same NRA convention. Obviously, the results of this have been very well known. Once you have this hatred of the other and radicalization and exploitation of AR-15, selling them at all costs, well, then they were used in many places across the country. And this young gal is standing here with a sign reminding us of many of the places where those AR-15s were used: Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs. I could go on. There, of course, have been more since she stood there with a sign that said, "Not one more." I witnessed in the industry perhaps the most egregious use of conspiracy theory and sort of wrapped up in hatred of the other and racism was the degree to which President Obama was demonized, and then very unhinged conspiracy theories and ideas were driven about him and his politics. The NRA ran ads that said Barack Obama was going to literally rewrite the Constitution, that he's going to ban all hunting ammunition, that he was going to remove the Second Amendment from the Constitution, that he was going to withdraw the right of Americans to own guns. All of these sound hyperbolic, and I think we understand that constitutional law prohibits a president from having any of these powers. But before QAnon came about, I saw these NRA sort of hyperbolic statements sort of drop into the ethos at speeches, at through advertisements, through something very similar to QAnon drops, and they sounded insane at first. But then as I looked around these rooms metaphorically, I noticed that people were believing them. And so when we came to 2016, 17, 18, 19, 2020, and QAnon and conspiracy theory and the big lie, I had seen this coming for many years because I had seen the same sort of hyperbolic use of racism and conspiracy. Also should be noted that gun sales skyrocketed despite all these threats and conspiracy theories. Gun sales skyrocketed under the 8 years of President Obama, and he was widely referred to in the firearms industry by almost everybody as, quote, the best gun salesman in America. That's what everybody called him. This is a picture of President Obama on the day of, at his press conference on the day of the Sandy Hook shooting. What I witnessed was that the entity in which I work, the firearms industry, had become one with the NRA, and that Wayne LaPierre and the NRA had perfected a system by which everything could be converted into more sales and more radicalization. So even a shooting at Sandy Hook, after a week of assessing it with marketing firms, Ackerman McQueen in Oklahoma City, that too could be converted to ever more sales, more hatred of the other, more conspiracy. President Obama, because he called for legislative action, only became more hated. And so the system became a spiral of hatred, conspiracy, power, more votes. That was going on back in 2008, 9, 10, 2012. And if that sounds like a precursor to our modern politics now, where literally everything, no matter what, is spun into more hatred and fear and conspiracy, that's because it was the NRA developed and perfected this system. And then I argue in my book that the system was handed off to the political right. And here we are today. This is a Christmas card issued by a sitting member of the US Congress, Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky, there in the lower left of your screen. Mr. Massey saw fit to break down another social norm. He issued this Christmas card 2 days after the Oxford High School shooting in Michigan. The gun he is holding there is an M60 that's typically carried by very physically fit officers in the US military. That gun also famously is the gun of Rambo. That's the gun that Rambo uses in the First Blood movies, where he fires it from his hip. That gun fires 652 rounds a minute. So you can do the calculation there, but this is the sort of norm, the sort of radicalization norm that has been broken down. I guess I want to explain and warn that it's unlikely that this system is going to get any better. The system itself. I'm going to get to some points of hope, but much like the political system on the right, the radicalized system of the firearms industry is set to become ever worse because the incentives are only for it to get worse. How do you sell more guns? Well, you develop a new AR-15 with an even edgier sort of marketing campaign. This is one that's being sold and marketed now. It's called the Urban Super Sniper. And I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to figure out what you're supposed to do with an urban super sniper. You know, this is obviously to take into inner cities and use as indicated to be an urban super sniper. This is a picture I took from an NRA show where we are now grooming our young kids to glorify the weapons of war. This is an 88-pound helicopter gun that fires about 800 rounds per minute, it's a 50 cal BMG, meaning that gun has a range of about 1.5 miles and can blow holes in vehicles at that range. And as I snapped this photo, there were the parents of this young boy were sitting around clapping and beaming that he was there doing this. So this is the sort of propagation that's happening inside the firearms industry. These are pictures I snapped just from the last few days. For those of you who think the industry will be brought back to sanity by itself, this is Donald Trump Jr. He's holding a Q, literally a QAnon AR-15, which is pictured up there on the right. It has a Hillary for prison 30-round magazine in it, which is the picture on the left there. And then lately we have this wonderful propagation of the Joe Biden 30-round AR-15 magazines. I won't utter the words there, but you can read them for yourself. You can now buy these AR-15 magazines in various forms by the truckload if you wish. And I'm not sure if there's any way to misinterpret what a 30-round magazine with that sort of insult to a sitting US president is supposed to mean. At the same, the SHOT Show that happened about a month ago, this is just an example of the incentives and the ever increasing edginess of marketing campaigns. There was a new company that was debuted there. It was called We Tactical, as in we kid, small kid, like we kid tactical. This is the logo for that company. A small girl skeleton with pigtails and a pacifier, and a small boy skeleton with his blonde hair and a pacifier. And these are miniaturized AR-15s for small little kids. So that's the new company that has been debuted. And again, I just want to, I just have one more slide after this, but this sort of purposeful radicalization by the NRA, this sort of twisting of culture, of the culture that I grew up with into something that's very different and dangerous, is now at the very center of our country. And that's why you see every rally that looks something like this. I don't know that I've seen one where you don't have a flag like that Second Amendment "Don't Tread on Me" flag at the center of it all. So the last slide I have here, there is hope. I will say that I'm not very hopeful about our political institutions on the right, our political parties on the right. I'm not very hopeful about the way the industry, the firearms industry and the NRA are interwoven into them. I am quite hopeful, given the sort of reaction that I have received from reasonable, responsible firearms owners across the country. I think change can come. It will come from individual, responsible people who have had it up to their eyeballs with much of what we've just discussed here the last few minutes. Before I hopped on this Zoom call with you all, I was answering emails and direct messages from more of these people who have reached out. I rarely get trolling messages. I get messages from gun owners who say, thank you for doing this. I have been a gun owner my whole life. I can't take it anymore. We have to be a part of the solution, not the problem. So my point is, there is hope, but it's going to come from individuals, not from the institution. So I'm happy to take questions from anybody. I'm going to see if I can unshare this screen now and answer questions or carry on the discussion as Cornell and Richard see fit. So thank you.
All right, thanks. So let me begin. You know, I actually first heard about your book on NPR, but what made me read it is actually a friend of mine who works as a gun distributor, has worked in that industry for years. And he said, you know, your experiences mirrored his own with respect to what's happened to the gun industry. And he said, it's just an incredible read. He said, it's exactly the way I felt about everything. And so I guess my question is this, how many people in the gun industry do you think feel the way you do? Are you an outlier, or are there a lot of people, critical mass of people in the industry who just are afraid to speak up? Or what do you think? What's your sense of that?
Three things. Most of the folks like me have migrated out of the industry over the last dozen years or so. It's because it became so evident that it was very difficult to have a differing opinion. So some folks have left. There's an Upton Sinclair quote, and I'm going to very much butcher it, so I won't even really try, but the general gist of it is that a man's ability to see the truth is diametrically opposed to the degree to which his paycheck depends upon it. And I think there's much of that in the industry. Were it not for the fact that fortunes are being made in the gun industry, there would be a lot more people who would believe this. The last thing, there have been a few, but that reached out to me that are still in the industry, but there is a very, very powerful police state, kind of a thought police inside the business, very much like Republican politics today. There really isn't much of an incentive to be a Liz Cheney or an Adam Kinzinger, because all will be lost, your friends, your social circle, everything. So there have been a few that once were in it. There are a few that are in it that have reached out, but there's certainly not a critical mass inside.
So I have a question from Dave Walters. He asks, is America's love of guns driven by some kind of paranoia? Why do you think the desire for guns is so strong in the US compared to other developed nations?
So I think there's a two-part answer to that. In 1995, I detail, that there were 3 to 5 million guns sold a year. And almost every single one of those guns fit into a very defined business niche. They were a target gun. They were a hunting shotgun. They were a self-defense pistol. They were a hunting rifle. In other words, you could look at them and know exactly what they were for. And then 3 to 5 million units. Today, we have 20 to 25 million units being sold. And a huge portion of that change from 3 to 5 to 20 to 25, you look at them and you think, I don't know what they're being used for. Other than paranoia, hatred, fear. Some people have a sick fantasy about some civil war that's coming. Some people have been told to fear their neighbor enough to buy them. And so I think there's a good portion of guns still that are bought and owned for very healthy reasons. A good, celebrated Norman Rockwellian part of America. I think there's an increasing amount that are purchased because of this fear and paranoia, and that system now feeds on itself. It's getting ever worse.
Luke Primo asks, how can reasonable NRA members take the group back from the powerful and greedy? Can they vote Wayne out or just leave the NRA? What's the response there?
I've long since given up on believing that the NRA can be saved or be converted into anything else. I think it's damaged goods doesn't even begin to describe it. So I think that reasonable, responsible gun owners have to rise up in a new way. We have to, it starts at kitchen tables and, with friends at bars and, places where influence happens. And I think we have to build it from the ground up. I don't think the NRA is salvageable.
What's going on with the litigation against the NRA and the bankruptcy? Is that
so? Yeah. So the NRA, Letitia James in New York has targeted the NRA for all of the stuff that has been in the news, egregious misappropriation and corruption. The NRA tried to file bankruptcy to get out of that. So they tried to move to Dallas and file bankruptcy. The bankruptcy judge in Texas said, no, sorry, you can't you can't try to get out of a legal action by filing bankruptcy. So they're back in court. The bankruptcy has been denied, and James in New York is undergoing the investigation, and I expect it will turn up some very, very bad stuff.
Yeah. Nancy Street asks, could you address the availability of ghost guns? Can they be counted in statistics?
Very good question. No, they cannot. Ghost guns, for those who don't know what a ghost gun is, so all the statistics that I quote in the book, that I reference generally in the presentation we just looked at, are generally taken from what's called NICS, the National Instant Background Check System that was instituted by the Brady Bill in the 1994 crime bill, which also instituted the assault weapons ban. That relies upon serialization. In other words, a gun company makes a gun, they have a serial number on it, they have to report that to the ATF. That then goes into all the statistics that you just saw. A ghost gun is a gun that is almost a gun, but not quite. It's pieces of guns, and it's not required to have a serial number on it because it doesn't quite meet the definition of, think of like your car, that it may be absent the motor, but otherwise it looks like a car, but it's not really deemed a car until the motor goes into it. Well, that's what a ghost gun is. People buy these ghost guns, they have to drill, I'm oversimplifying here, but they have to drill just a couple holes and put some things together, and then it becomes a gun, and they're not serialed. And a few years ago, there were a few dozen of these things. People thought of them as a joke because why would you want to go to this trouble? Why would you try to get around reporting the serial to the ATF? Why? Well, it's now a huge, huge, huge problem, as in likely millions of units that aren't reported, aren't tracked. There are no records of them. They don't have serial numbers on them. If they're found in a crime, they can't be traced. That's how guns are traced, by serial numbers. And so, to the point of the question, all of the data from here on is likely to become much less accurate because ghost guns are not in that data. They're not tracked. That's the whole point of having a ghost gun. At the most recent SHOT Show, there were 22 ghost gun parts manufacturers welcomed to the SHOT Show by the industry.
Let's see. John Gay asks, what's the relationship between our toxic gun culture and toxic masculinity?
Very tight, very tight. Again, I use the sort of example of that dinner. If you want to be the big guy in the room and upend civil discussion and sort of shred the meritocracy, well, all you need is an AR-15 to walk into the room, right? And so nothing could be more toxically masculine than an AR-15 that puts you on the top of the stack no matter what. So there's a reason why these angry people who confront people at the Michigan Capitol, or like the ones that confronted my own son here, or so many other places across the country, are generally angry men with AR-15s.
So White Sturgeon asks, he says, you speak of conspiracy theory, yet you demonize the AR platform as weapons of war. Do you acknowledge that the Constitution gives people the right to protect themselves from tyrannical government?
I think that's a very complex question. I generally accept yes. I don't know that I would word it exactly all of those ways, and I don't demonize particular platforms or guns. I do demonize radicals who use those guns and who convert them to political symbols. I do think that Americans do have the right to own guns and to protect themselves. Yes, I do.
So, so let me ask you another question that's occurred to me on a number of occasions. We talk about efforts to try to control the sales of military-style weapons, and one of the retorts you often hear is that it's impossible to define what an assault rifle is, and so you can't regulate the sale of assault rifles. Do you think that's the case? I mean, is that the problem with regulating military-style weapons?
Yeah, it's complex. There's no simple answer. I think most people would be sort of surprised to know that during the 10 years from September 13th, 1994 to September 13th of 2004, the assault weapons ban was in place in the United States. And AR-15s were perfectly legal to produce, own, and sell. A lot of people don't know that. They think that AR-15s were somehow banned by the assault weapons ban. They were not banned by the assault weapons ban. AR-15s with a list of additional features were banned because they then became, by definition, an assault weapon. So during the 10 years of the assault weapons ban, anybody on this call today could purchase almost as many AR-15s as they wanted to buy. They just couldn't purchase them with a folding stock and a flash suppressor, for instance. The point here is that I think there is a case to be made that the definition of assault weapons is this sort of nebulous, what is it actually? Does it have this list of features or not list of features? And I think it's easy to get bogged down in that. It makes policy very, very difficult. I think that those who are not in favor of a ban make a good point that the definitions, it's sort of like saying, well, that person's tall. Well, what does tall mean? 5'6", 6'6", 6 foot? I don't know. That's very much like an assault weapon, what the definition of an assault weapon is. So it is difficult.
So Tristan G asks, what policies do you think are best at limiting illegal gun violence while also preserving rights of gun owners?
I think the first thing we have to do is sort of institute this new love affair, a renewed love affair with our social norms. There's no panacea. I don't think there's any panacea. I don't think there's a perfect solution. I don't think we're going to make gun violence, quote unquote, go away. I think we can do things that reduce gun violence. I think we can do things that reduce gun radicalization. And I'm very worried personally at current about the health of our democracy and the degree to which gun radicalization is at the very heart of it. And so for me, I would like to see the country rise up and say open carry is no more, because open carry is a tool of intimidation, just period, end of story. If you need to carry an AR-15 downtown to prove the sort of man you are, I think it's obvious that you're doing that to intimidate people. And a democracy does not work when one party is standing over the other, intimidating that person with an AR-15. So I would like to see norms, us find this, again, renewed love affair with our norms and say open carry intimidation is just not accepted. If we can't do that, yes, I think we need legislation to sort of limit those things. And that's the way a democracy works. We either have norms that make a society work, or we have regulations that enforce those norms, much like, a speed limit in a school zone.
Let me ask you about another policy, and that's the 2005 SHIELD law that was passed by Congress. Is that something you would be in favor of seeing repealed? And follow-on question is, what do you think about this California law that's being proposed right now, which sort of is a copycat of the Texas abortion law that would allow individuals to sell gun manufacturers and those who sell guns for the liability for what happens with their product?
So the SHIELD law you mentioned is called Placa. It's Protection of Unlawful Commerce in Arms Act. It was passed in 2005, signed by George Bush just after his reelection. And it limits, it provides one of the few corporate shields for any group of corporations or industry in the United States. It essentially it shields firearms companies from being sued for much of the quote unquote unlawful or irresponsible use of their product. The problem I have with the law is that it also allows some of the worst actors in the industry to sort of get off scot-free. So some of those egregious marketing campaigns that you saw in my presentation, those are largely protected. Even if horrible outcomes originate from those marketing campaigns, those are largely protected from that law. So I don't think it's pro-gun or pro-responsibility or pro-patriotism to allow things that we care about, and I do care about guns and firearms. I have a deep appreciation for the right, and I use them quite often. I don't really want irresponsible people to be empowered to put those rights at risk, and I think they will eventually put our rights at risk if we don't hold each other to account. So I'm troubled with some of the implications of that law. I'm dubious of the Texas approach on abortion, and I'm dubious of the California approach on guns. I don't think this empowering vigilantes in either case is very American. I'm frankly shocked that the Supreme Court has allowed the Texas thing to go on as long as it has, and I'm dubious that it can be upheld in California, but I've been surprised before, so we'll see.
So as a follow-up, I guess, on that is the Remington Settlement, because that had to do with the marketing of guns rather than the liability for what they were used for. Do you think that's going to spur a lot more litigation under state laws that prohibit that kind of marketing?
I doubt it. I think that my own sense is that was a horrific outlier, an egregious case that happened to be used in, probably the most horrific school shooting any of us can imagine. 20 little first graders being killed and 6 of their teachers. I'm dubious that you're going to see, because of Placa, because of the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, I'm dubious you're going to see a lot more action in and around those cases. I could be wrong, but I see it as a sort of signal to those parents that there is some measure of justice in the world, although I'm positive that no amount of money, that they really don't care about the money, but they finally do have some admission that that they're somewhat justified in their anger and grief. But I don't know legally that the case sets a huge precedent.
Yeah. Jedi Canfield asks, is there a correlation between what's going on in the entertainment industry and what's going on with our gun culture, as in our guns now more openly used in movies and entertainment, et cetera? I
think I haven't studied it. I didn't live inside the film industry. I'm a consumer of film and movies just like everybody else. I think there is a case to be made that that this sort of desensitization in and around movies and film does have some measure of impact on this. And I will tell you that it's sort of odd that the firearms industry is right in the middle of that too, because most firearms companies are very aggressive at trying to get their guns into film. That's a thing that marketing companies do. So I think some people want to separate them, like, well, it's just movies or it's guns. I've seen an intertwining of that. And I think there's a reason, right? There's a profit motive. You get a gun in a movie and it's used in a certain way, it will sell products. So there's a profit motive there, but it also, much like the rest of the marketing campaign, it can have some pretty disastrous spillover effects too.
Another YouTube viewer asks about the line or the relationship between religion and guns, and wondered if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, and for those of you who have not read Kristen Dumais' fabulous book, Jesus and John Wayne, I highly recommend it. I think there's a very strong correlation in the sort of white nationalist growing, religious fervor and guns, the way guns are used and marketed and sort of propagate masculinity in that way. She spends several pages near the end of her book tying some of those things together. So that's a good one to read if you haven't, but I think there's definitely a correlation. Yes.
Alex Hammond asks, he says, the gun industry obviously has international as well as US markets. Can you talk about gun sales globally and how other nations have been able to deal with the kinds of fear, conspiracy, marketing strategies you've talked about?
Well, First things first, we are assuming, I think it's Alex, assuming he's here in the United States, he and the rest of us are sitting in the middle of the largest civilian firearms market on the earth by several factors. And so this really is the center of the universe with regards to gun marketing, everything else. I think, as you noted in your lead in, Cornell, that like there really isn't a country anywhere close to what we have. And so there isn't this sort of runaway marriage of irresponsible marketing and sort of quarterly capitalism that drives these profits and these numbers and these skyrocketing sales at all costs. There have been aggressive gun control actions in places like Australia, places like Great Britain. Canada has much stricter gun control or gun legislation than we do. And I'm not, in my book, I really don't get into long dissertations about advocating for this law or that law. I really get into the sort of cultural connections and cultural intertwinedness of radicalization with guns, and the sort of breakdown of social norms. A whole nother book could be, comparing what laws have been enacted in Australia, and I think some of those laws probably have gone overboard, right, in Australia or Great Britain or whatever. But I'm concerned with my experience in my book is largely the United States as far as like amount of guns sold. There is an international market, and there are international manufacturers. Those international manufacturers want to come to the they want to sell in the United States. U.S. manufacturers do export some guns. Largely those, for the most part, those are police and military sales across the world, with some very limited civilian sales across the world in places like Western Europe and Australia, New Zealand.
What do you think about these efforts? Some communities have launched gun buyback programs to try to get some of the guns out of circulation.
Those sorts of voluntary programs, especially in underserved communities, communities where crime is rampant, I think those are fine. Those are voluntary. Those aren't mandatory sorts of programs. I think the people in every community deserve to have the sort of programs that they vote for and advocate through their government.
So Tristan G asks, how often are ghost guns used in crimes? And are you saying they can't be recorded by police after the fact?
They are used in an increasing number of crimes. I don't think we know that yet. I haven't seen any data. There could be data on it, and I'm not sure how it's going to be reported, because the whole gun reporting tracing thing is built upon being able to ascertain the serial number of the gun. That's why up until this point, one of the most serious gun crimes you could commit would be to remove a serial number from a gun. But because of the loophole in the law, the ghost gun doesn't have a serial number. So that most serious of all gun crimes isn't even a crime with a ghost gun. It didn't have a serial number to start with. And I don't know how we're going to track that, or what the answer to Tristan's question is exactly, because I'm not sure what the mechanism will be to trace that.
Okay, I probably have time for one more question. This might be a good one to end the discussion with. From John Gay asks, what led to Ryan's enlightenment with regard to social norms, democracy, and the like?
A few things. Better people than me in my life, for one. My wife, Sarah. The thing that really pushed me over the edge, I guess, though, if I had to point to a singular thing, in 2004, I was called to do a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., when the Bush administration, and it was to be critical of the Bush administration and the Bush-Cheney oil and gas exploration effort, really the Cheney energy plan. And I have always been an environmental advocate, and I believe that, if I stood up for the sort of wild places where people like me use our guns and hunt and fish, that it would be difficult for the industry to attack me on those tenets, because again, I was just standing up for places where we want to use our guns, where we want to hunt and fish. Some of the most iconic wild places in the country, the Val Vidal in New Mexico, the Rome Plateau in Colorado, the Badger II Medicine in Montana. And I did that press conference. I was already changing politically, but then I was attacked vociferously because I dared say bad words about a Republican and I was inside the industry. And so the whole kind of single party police state in my mind clicked into place. I realized that I and many other people had been duped into believing that this was about some sort of wholesome, hunting, fishing, Americana thing. And it wasn't. It was all about political power for one party. And so I point to that single instance in my book. My transformation was larger than that, but if I have to point to a single event, it was that.
All right. Well, I'm afraid our time is up. Before I thank our guests, let me remind you all that we on Thursday this week, we have another event talking about the Ukraine crisis with Tom Preston. That'll be our first in-person event actually in 2 years. So that's at the Foley Institute at noon on Thursday. So join us then. And now let me thank our guests for a really interesting conversation. And I got to say, Ryan, I read your book. It's one of the best reads I've had in a long time. It's well written. It's informative. It is, as you say, a deeply personal story, but one I think that many people, especially those of us who've grown up out west, can somehow associate ourselves with and understand. So thanks again for joining us today, and thank you in the audience, and we hope to see you all on Thursday.
Thanks so much for having me, and appreciate everybody being concerned and trying to make the world a better place. Thank you.